The city of Arden lay broken beside the river, its bridges shattered, its streets littered with the remains of hurried departures. Smoke rose in thin columns, drifting into the pale sky like warnings to anyone who dared approach. On the eastern bank, a small unit of soldiers had taken shelter in the ruins of a library, its shelves collapsed, its books burned into ash. Sergeant Cole leaned against a cracked pillar, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had fought in 3 campaigns already, but Arden felt different. The silence here was heavier, as if the city itself mourned. Beside him, Private Lena adjusted her helmet, her hands trembling though she tried to hide it. She was young, barely 20, yet the war had already carved shadows beneath her eyes. The river flowed sluggishly, carrying debris downstream, fragments of wood, twisted metal, even the occasional helmet. It was both barrier and lifeline, separating them from the western bank where enemy patrols moved like phantoms. Every night, the soldiers listened to the distant echoes of gunfire, knowing the battle would soon reach them. Cole gathered the unit around a lantern. "We hold this position until dawn," he said, his voice steady. "If the river is crossed, we fight. If not, we wait." His words were simple, but the weight behind them was immense. Waiting meant uncertainty, and uncertainty was its own kind of torture. As darkness fell, Lena whispered to herself, a prayer half-remembered from childhood. She did not know if anyone listened, but the act gave her courage. The others lay in silence, each carrying their own ghosts. Arden was no longer a city, it was a graveyard waiting to be filled. And the river, silent and slow, promised that the storm was only beginning. The dawn broke with a pale light, shimmering across the sluggish current of the river. Mist clung to the water, hiding shapes that might have been driftwood, or soldiers waiting to strike. Sergeant Cole stood at the edge, boots sinking into the mud, his breath visible in the cold air. Behind him, the unit prepared their gear, tightening straps, checking ammunition. The silence was broken only by the creak of metal and the distant cry of crows. Private Lena watched the river with wide eyes. "It looks endless," she whispered. Cole shook his head. "It's not endless. It's dangerous. That's different." His words carried the weight of experience, but they did little to ease her fear. The river was more than water, it was a boundary between survival and annihilation. At midday, scouts reported movement on the western bank. Enemy patrols were gathering, their silhouettes faint through the mist. The soldiers of Arden's Libera fortress tightened their formation. Cole ordered silence, every rifle aimed across the water. For hours, they waited, nerves stretched thin. Then, without warning, the enemy began to cross. Small boats pushed into the current, all slicing through the fog. The first shots rang out, echoing across the valley. Lena fired, her hands trembling, but her bullet struck true. The boat lurched, one figure collapsing into the river. Chaos erupted, shouts, gunfire, splashes. The river became a battlefield, its surface torn by bullets and blood. Cole shouted commands, his voice steady even as the world dissolved into violence. By nightfall, the crossing had failed. The enemy retreated, leaving broken boats drifting downstream. The soldiers of Arden stood exhausted, their faces pale, their hands shaking. Yet they had held the line. The river remained theirs, for now. But Cole knew the enemy would return, stronger, more determined. And when they did, the silent river would demand another sacrifice. The night after the failed crossing, Arden's ruin seemed to breathe with uneasy silence. The soldiers tried to rest, but the echo of gunfire lingered in their minds. Lena lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of the library, her thoughts circling the river. She wondered how many faces she had seen vanish into the mist, and whether her own would one day join them. At dawn, a scout named Rourke returned with news. While searching the western ruins, he had discovered a tunnel hidden beneath collapsed stonework. It stretched beneath the river, an old smuggling route forgotten by time. The revelation sent a ripple of tension through the unit. The tunnel was both opportunity and danger, a secret path that could allow them to strike, or be struck. Cole studied the map, tracing the river's bend with his finger. If the enemy knows of this tunnel, they'll use it soon, he said grimly. We must secure it before they do. His words carried urgency, but also risk. Entering the tunnel meant leaving the fragile safety of the outpost. That evening, Cole led a small team, Alina, Rourke, and 2 others, into the ruins. The entrance was narrow, hidden beneath rubble, its air damp and foul. They descended with lanterns, the flickering light revealing walls carved with old markings, remnants of smugglers who had once thrived in Arden's shadows. The tunnel stretched endlessly, the sound of dripping water echoing like distant footsteps. Halfway through, they found signs of recent passage, footprints pressed into the mud, scraps of cloth snagged on jagged stone. The enemy had already discovered the route. Cole's jaw tightened. We seal it, or we fight here, he whispered. The decision weighed heavily, for sealing the tunnel meant cutting off their own chance of escape. As the lanterns dimmed, the soldiers realized the tunnel was no longer a forgotten relic. It was a battlefield waiting to awaken, and its darkness held secrets that could decide the fate of Arden itself. The tunnel silence was broken by the faint scrape of boots against stone. Cole raised his hand, signaling the unit to halt. Lanterns dimmed, breaths held, the soldiers pressed themselves against the damp walls. From the darkness ahead, voices echoed, foreign, sharp, carrying the cadence of enemy commands. The tunnel was no longer theirs alone. Rourke leaned forward, whispering, "They're coming this way." His words were barely audible, but the tension in the air made them heavy. Cole's mind raced. Retreat meant leaving the tunnel open, a path for the enemy to strike Arden from within. Standing their ground meant fighting in a narrow corridor where every bullet could ricochet, every scream amplified. The decision came swiftly. "We hold here," Cole said. He positioned Lena at the rear, her rifle steady despite the tremor in her hands. The others crouched low, weapons raised, waiting for the shadows to emerge. Moments later, the enemy appeared. Figures moving cautiously, lanterns casting jagged silhouettes against the walls. Cole fired first, the shot echoing like thunder. Chaos erupted. Bullets tore through the tunnel, sparks flying as they struck stone. The confined space magnified the violence, turning every sound into a roar. Lena's rifle cracked, dropping one soldier who had lunged forward with a blade. Rourke swung his lantern, blinding another before driving his bayonet into the darkness. The tunnel became a storm of fire and steel, each heartbeat a gamble between survival and death. When silence finally returned, the floor was littered with bodies, the air thick with smoke and blood. Cole's unit stood battered but alive, their faces pale, their eyes wide. They had won the ambush, but the cost was clear, the enemy now knew the tunnel was contested. Arden's fragile defense had gained a victory, yet it had also invited a greater storm. The days after the tunnel ambush brought no relief. Instead, the enemy returned with fury, surrounding Arden's ruins with artillery and patrols. The library fortress shook under bombardment, its walls crumbling further with each strike. Smoke filled the air, choking the soldiers as they scrambled to reinforce barricades with broken furniture and shattered stone. Cole stood at the center, issuing orders with a voice that cut through the chaos. "Hold the eastern wall. Rotate shifts. No one rests while the guns are firing." His commands carried strength, but inside he felt the weight of inevitability. The siege was not a battle, it was a slow strangulation. Lena moved tirelessly, carrying ammunition, tending wounds, and firing when the enemy pressed too close. Her fear had hardened into resolve, each shot a defiance against the storm outside. Rourke, scarred from the tunnel fight, worked to repair the radio, hoping for a signal, a call for reinforcements. But the static remained, mocking their isolation. At night, the bombardment ceased, replaced by silence more terrifying than the explosions. The soldiers whispered of tunnels, of betrayal, of the possibility that Arden was already lost. Cole listened, but he did not silence them. He knew morale was fragile, and truth was heavier than lies. On the third day, scouts reported enemy engineers near the river, preparing bridges under cover of darkness. The siege was tightening, the enemy intent on crossing not only with boats but with steel and stone. Cole gathered the unit, his face grim. This is no longer defense. This is survival. We fight until the river itself rejects them. The soldiers nodded, weary yet unbroken. Arden's ruins had become their graveyard, but also their stand. The siege had begun, and with it, the test of whether courage could outlast despair. On the 7th night of the siege, the enemy unleashed their fury. Artillery shells rained down without pause, turning Arden's ruins into a furnace of fire and stone. The library fortress shook violently, its walls collapsing in showers of dust. Flames spread across the eastern quarter, consuming what little shelter remained. The soldiers fought not only the enemy but the inferno itself. Cole dragged wounded men from the rubble, his uniform scorched, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. "Hold the line! Do not break," he cried, though his own strength was fading. Lena stumbled through the smoke, coughing, her rifle clutched tightly. She fired blindly into the haze, each shot a desperate attempt to push back shadows that seemed endless. The firestorm was relentless. Ammunition ignited, sending bursts of flame into the night. The river glowed red, reflecting the chaos above. Rourke, his hands burned, managed to repair the radio long enough to send a single message. Arden under siege. Firestorm. Reinforcements needed. Whether anyone heard, none could say. By dawn, the city was unrecognizable. Streets had become rivers of ash, buildings reduced to skeletal frames. The soldiers gathered in the library's shattered hall, their faces blackened, their eyes hollow. They had survived, but survival felt like defeat. Arden was burning, and with it, the hope that had sustained them. Cole looked at his unit, each soldier scarred yet standing. "The firestorm was meant to break us," he said quietly. "But we are still here. And as long as we remain, Arden is not lost." His words carried no triumph, only defiance. The siege had taken everything but their will, and that will burned brighter than the flames that consumed the city. The siege had dragged into its third week, and Arden was little more than rubble. The library fortress, once a sanctuary of knowledge, now stood as a fractured shell, its walls scorched and hollow. Yet within those ruins, Cole's unit remained, battered but unbroken. Supplies were dwindling, ammunition scarce, but their resolve had hardened into something unshakable. At dawn, scouts reported the enemy massing across the river, preparing for a final assault. Bridges had been raised, artillery positioned, and banners unfurled. The storm was coming, and Cole knew this would be their last stand. He gathered the soldiers in the shattered hall, his voice steady despite the exhaustion etched into his face. "We fight not for victory," he said, "but for memory. Arden must not fall forgotten." Lena listened, her heart pounding. She had grown from a frightened recruit into a soldier forged by fire. Her rifle felt heavier now, not from its weight but from the burden of what it represented. She looked at her comrades, Rourke with his scarred hands, the others with hollow eyes, and realized they were no longer just survivors. They were guardians of a city that no longer existed, defenders of an idea that refused to die. When the assault began, the sky itself seemed to collapse. Artillery thundered, bridges groaned under the weight of advancing troops, and the river churned with boats. Cole's unit met them with everything they had: bullets, grenades, even stones when ammunition ran dry. The battle was chaos, a storm of steel and fire, but within it burned a defiance that no weapon could extinguish. By nightfall, the fortress was a graveyard. The enemy pressed closer, yet Arden's defenders held, their silhouettes etched against the flames. Cole stood at the eastern wall, rifle empty, blade in hand. "This is where we end," he whispered, not in despair but in pride. The last stand had begun, and with it, the legacy of Arden would be written in blood and fire. The final assault left Arden in ruins, its streets buried beneath ash and silence. When the smoke cleared, only a handful of Cole's unit remained, their bodies weary, their spirits scarred. The library fortress had collapsed entirely, its stones scattered like bones across the ground. Yet within that devastation, something endured. Lena stood at the riverbank, her rifle broken, her hands trembling. She watched the water carry fragments of battle downstream, helmets, banners, shattered wood. The river had witnessed everything, and now it whispered the memory of those who had fallen. She closed her eyes, hearing not the roar of artillery but the voices of comrades who had fought beside her. Cole, wounded but alive, leaned against the ruins. His voice was faint, but his words carried weight. "We are not defeated," he said. "As long as someone remembers, Arden lives." His statement was not for victory, but for legacy. The city had been destroyed, yet its defenders had carved their story into history with blood and fire. Days later, when reinforcements finally arrived, they found only silence. The survivors spoke little, their eyes haunted, but their presence alone told the tale. Arden had not surrendered, it had resisted until the end. The enemy had taken the land, but they could not erase the courage that had burned within its walls. Years would pass, and Arden would remain a ruin. Yet travelers who crossed the silent river would pause, sensing something in the air, a weight, a memory, an echo. They would whisper of the last stand, of soldiers who fought until the city itself became their grave. And in those whispers, Arden lived on, not as stone or fire, but as defiance eternal.